Hey guys, it's time for my August rewind, which I know is going up fairly late, but better late than never. So this is a look at what I read in August with a quick thumbs up, thumbs down rating. And with the exception of one book, everything I read in August was, of course, Jane Austen related, because it was Austen in August. So here are the books. The first book I read, and the only one that wasn't Jane Austen related, was The Fairest of Them All by Carolyn Turgeon, which I have done an excerpt for. You can check that out, as well as my review. It is a retelling of Rapunzel, but also of Snow White, and it's really interesting to see how those two work together, so in this case, big thumbs up. I really like Carolyn Turgeon's style, and I like how she sort of analyzes the stories and works her way behind the scenes and into what makes things happen, what motivates a character, what turns someone into the evil queen, or what's the chain of events that makes something snowball and then avalanche. So I really like how she approaches things. It's very engaging. This one is not magical realist in the way that Godmother was. It's not going to leave you guessing at the end. It's not necessarily open to interpretation. It's more a self-contained story, so those of you who were put off by Godmother or afraid to read Godmother because you don't like those open endings and that ambiguity, this one's probably a good one for you to pick up. It is adult, though I would say it could be an older YA crossover. I don't know that I'd go very young, and if you know the original tales of Rapunzel and Snow White, you'll know that they're not the most kid-friendly of stories, so understandably a retelling of them that really goes at it like that isn't going to be the most kid-friendly either, but older YA, definitely good if you like fairy tales, if you like things that are sort of turned on their head, or if you just like those complex characters and those issues that aren't black and white but have a lot of gray area. This is definitely a good one for you to pick up. I reread Mansfield Park so that I could write up discussion questions for it, and I myself did not have time to answer my own discussion questions, even though I had things that I wanted to say. Oh boy, did I have things I wanted to say. I think when I do have time, I'll probably tackle those, maybe in a vlog, but for now, I'm just going to talk about, how Mansfield Park has changed for me. This was never... It's always been my least favorite, but it's never one that I hated. So I did like it when I first read it as a teenager, but I was let down by things, and I think that's because I was reading it as the surface romance story that I was expecting it to be. But as I mentioned a couple times in vlogs and throughout Austen August, Jane Austen doesn't just write romance. Those are definitely the surface stories. That's kind of a minor concern, honestly, even though that's purportedly what the stories are about. This one is so much more complex than that. So I think a reread of it, even though it still brought to the fore some of those things that really bothered me about it the first time I read it, I think I appreciate it now more, and I think it's certainly the one with the most meat to kind of chew on, It has the most room for discussion and room for interpretation and for things to either really bother you or really work for you. It has a lot going on in it, and it has some very frustrating characters, which makes it an interesting read and a frustrating read. Of course, it gets a thumbs up like all Jane Austen does for me. It's a more, not hesitant thumbs up, but thumbs up or down doesn't really do the story justice. This is a really good one, I think, for discussion and for rereads and for trying to understand these characters and their world and what makes them tick and what makes them so frustrating. So it's a really interesting one. Next up was Among the Janeites by Deborah Yaffe, which is a non-fiction look at the Jane Austen fandom, and it definitely gets a thumbs up. I was a little hesitant in the beginning because I was really looking forward to this, but there was this slight sort of, I described it as a sneering tone in my review, just slightly judgy, The author is a Janeite and has been since she was a child, but she was always one of the Janeites more focused on the stories and Jane Austen herself, and not the sort of wider, more commercial aspects of the fandom. In the beginning, when she's diving into this head first, is a little snarkier about all of those aspects, all of the memorabilia and the people that love, the Colin Firth in a wet shirt scene, which I think was kind of hilarious because I think that it's commonplace for most intellectual highbrow Janeites to start. Some people want to distance themselves from that and the impression that gives of sort of frothy romance and silly girlishness and not the meat of Jane Austen. But I think that there's room for all of it, for every aspect of the Jane Austen mania in the fandom. And so there's this transition in the book of where Deborah Yaffe starts out being a little bit more judgmental. I mean, she can see why, you know, people respond the way they do and write fan fictions and things like that, but she wasn't about to read a fan fiction, you know? And then as it goes along, she does all the things that she said she would never do. You know, she orders her own custom-made gown and she reads the fan fictions and just immerses herself in every aspect of being a Janeite. And that tone sort of slips away. And I loved that because it felt like an honest trajectory of just the hardcore Janeite. That really worked for me, and it got a thumbs up, and I loved the people that it introduced me to. As a Janeite, it's fun reading because, you know, I see myself, I recognize myself in these pages and in these people that are highlighted throughout. But I liked it because it introduced me to new ones and new aspects that I want to explore, and new fan fictions and new movies and theories, and it's just really good for anyone who considers themselves a Janeite, frankly. And beyond that, I think it's also just readable. Even if you're not a Janeite, if you're trying to understand some crazy person in your life or whatever, you just like good nonfiction and you like looks at fandoms, it's well written, it's engaging, it has a lot of interesting people and information in it, and I really liked it. I also read The Love Affairs of Nathaniel P. by Adele Waldman, which is not a Jane Austen retelling or even necessarily related, but one of the publicists talked me into including it in Austen August because Adele is getting a lot of comparisons to Jane Austen and being considered a sort of modern-day Jane Austen. I can see why that is, because she does have the same sort of incisive quality to her writing and looking at social interaction and dating and, you know, just general social mores in the way that Jane Austen did. And she herself is, you know, a fan of Jane Austen, so you can see that influence in her writing. Sort of like Mansfield Park, which is peopled with characters that you don't really root for. Nathaniel P. is full of unlikable characters, and Nathaniel P. himself is just not someone you really root for. I mean, you might root for him to change, you might root for a story of redemption, but he himself is just kind of an ass. And she captures that, and she really makes these characters believable, and you feel like you do know people like this, so from that aspect, I definitely get the Jane Austen references. I think, though, one of the things that I touched on with Mansfield Park is that the romances were sort of the surface story in Jane Austen. There's a lot more going on underneath. Those cicadas are so loud. And in this case, I don't know that there was necessarily that much more going on underneath. It's just about how these people interact in their relationships and why it goes wrong. It felt a little bit more like it was just those surface stories and like it's lacking some of the surprising depth that you get in Jane Austen. Now that might not be the case because a lot of that you get in Jane Austen through rereads. Every time you read it, you pick up something new. So maybe that's the case with Nathaniel P. too. But at the same time, I mean, you can't really expect someone with their debut novel to be Jane Austen and to get all of those layers and that depth. So I don't hold that against the book at all. I don't hold that against Adele Waldman. I can see why it's buzzed about, and I can see why it's a love it or hate it book for a lot of people. So it's a hard one to recommend because of that, because it's like, how do you say, hey, read this, you'll hate everyone? You know, that's kind of not the most glowing recommendation, but at the same time it is, because it means that you're engaged and that she has painted these characters for you fully and you understand them and they make you uncomfortable, and she's done her job as a writer. So it's an interesting one, and this is adult contemporary, by the way, not for the kids. So if that sounds like something that interests you, I would say pick it up. If you don't like being frustrated and you don't like reading through the eyes of a frustrating character, probably skip it. And the last book I read, actually listened to, was Ostentatious by Alyssa Goodnight. I listened to the audiobook of this one, and audio is always really hit and miss with me. In this case, big hit. The book itself is hilarious. I love Alyssa's style. The narration added to it. So Even though I was missing having a book and being able to tab all of the things that I found funny, I'm really glad that I listened to the audio because it really did add something to it, especially because the narrator, Janine Hegarty, had to do a lot of accents and a lot of different voices, and she did them all really, really well. She kept the characters straight. I always knew who was talking, which is impressive, especially with as many characters as there are. They were all distinct enough without being, you know, silly and over the top. And the accents she did really, really well. She had to do a Scottish accent quite a bit, and other than occasionally going a little Slavic on the R's, which I found hilarious, she did it really well. I liked it. She brought a lot of personality to Nicola, the main character, and it really felt like you were just, you know, talking to a friend and having them tell you what's going on, and it felt really personable and it felt really authentic to the characters and just thoroughly enjoyable. So yes, that one is Jane Austen influenced, but it's also just a straight contemporary romance, so if you haven't read Jane Austen or don't like Jane Austen but you like romance or you like contemporary, it would still totally work for you. I think you can't go wrong reading or listening to it, but if you want that extra little personal touch and bit of humor to it, I'd go with the audiobook. So that was what I read in August, and even though there were some like weirdnesses in there when it comes to recommending, it was thumbs up across the board, so I can't really knock that. Written reviews of every last one of those is on the blog, which is a rarity for me. Normally by the time I'm telling you guys about books, the review is still a little ways off, so I'm ahead of the game this time. Of course my video is like 2 weeks behind though. Links to the books as well as those reviews and anything else that might be pertinent can be found below. Let me know what you think of the books I read in the comments. And that is all for now. Until next time, as always, happy reading!